The Targaryen who sits the Iron Throne is not just a king or a queen. They are a protector of the realm. Now I find myself in an impossible position.
All hail, King Aegon!
The enemy usurped my throne.
We're going to King's Landing.
We know that House of the Dragon takes place 200 years before Game of Thrones, but the Targaryens' rise to power is a fascinating story on its own. In this video, I will explain everything that happened before the first season of House of the Dragon begins. This will help you understand the characters' history and why their actions in the show matter. I've gathered information from the book Fire and Blood and used Midjourney to create visuals based on the text in the book.
I did not think they would be so eager to die.
This episode contains no spoilers for either the House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones. In part 1 of this 3-part series, we will focus on the most intense and important characters in the book, Aegon the Conqueror. The book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin was published in 2018 following the A Song of Ice and Fire series of books that cover the events in Game of Thrones. It is a very different book. It is written in the style of a history book. It reads as if a maester of the Citadel is gathering information about the Targaryen lineage. The book itself has a preface stating that Volume 1 was written by Archmaester Gildane of the Citadel of Oldtown and transcribed by George Martin. This is a nice touch, as if George has stumbled upon this ancient tome and decided to translate it for modern readers. The book feels like a history manual and aims to stick to the facts as much as possible without any embellishments, metaphors or allegories. But before we get to Aegon Targaryen the Conqueror, let's look back at the Targaryens themselves. This ancient lineage was of pure Valyrian blood, respected as Dragon Lords of Valyria. Valyria was located south of Essos, and its inhabitants, the Valyrians, generally recognized by their silver hair and purple eyes, were avid practitioners of blood magic and sorcery. This volcanic peninsula had no fewer than 14 active volcanoes called the 14 Flames, but that didn't prevent the Valyrians from building one of the most prosperous empires in the known world. They relied on two things: dragons to conquer other lands, and slaves to do the hard work of mining and building. This turned Valyria into a place of wonder with both magical and technological advancements, such as construction techniques based on fused stone, where dragonfire was used to melt stone together, making buildings impregnable and very durable. The Targaryens were not the most powerful house in Valyria, and 100 years before the Conquest, Aenar Targaryen sold his holdings and took his household to a bleak island far away in the narrow sea called Dragonstone. It is said that Aenar decided to flee Valyria because his maiden daughter Rhaenys had foreseen the destruction of Valyria by fire. And she was not wrong. The doom of Valyria came 12 years later in the form of a cataclysmic event that shattered the island. It is said that all 14 flames erupted at once, pounding the peninsula with boulders of fire the size of castles. Most of Valyrians and the dragons perished, with survivors fleeing to the free cities of Essos. After the doom, the Targaryens were settled on Dragonstone and found themselves the only house in the world that had the power of controlling dragons and were of pure Valyrian blood. To be honest, the story of Aegon the Conqueror could have been an impressive TV series in itself, though likely more expensive to produce than House of the Dragon. Regarded as the most important Targaryen in the lineage, Aegon conquered almost the entirety of Westeros using his wits and his dragons. He solidified the Targaryens as a house to be feared, yet also a formidable ally if one pledged allegiance to them. Aegon was born in 27 BC on Dragonstone, the only child of a Targaryen father and a Valyrian mother. The Velaryons were a less known house, but they were skilled seafarers and became more powerful after the Doom, though they did not ride dragons. Aegon's father, Aerion, fathered two more children, true-born children, because they were born to both Targaryen parents. It was an ancient custom among dragon lords to wed brother to sister to preserve the purity of the bloodline, considering the powers associated with Targaryen blood. Thus, Aegon married both his trueborn sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. These three figures would prove to be among the most impactful and influential in the history of House Targaryen. Visenya was the eldest of the three of them and was very much an apt warrior, maybe even more skilled than Aegon himself, comfortable in ringmail more than silk. The Valyrian longsword Dark Sister was a weapon of mass destruction in her hands, and she trained alongside her brother from an early age. Visenya had a harsh, austere beauty matched by her stern, serious and unforgiving character. She was less social than her younger siblings and dabbled in dark sorceries. Rhaenys, on the other side, was the opposite of Visenya. She was playful, curious and impulsive. She loved music, poetry and dancing, and was known to sport singers, mummers and puppeteers. And she loved to fly. She mounted Meraxes at an early age, and it was said that she wanted to fly to the ends of the known world across the Sunset Sea. Rhaenys was one to surround herself with comely young men and sometimes even entertain them in her bedchambers, although none of this was officially confirmed. Aegon knew well to choose to marry both of his sisters, some saying that he took Visenya out of duty and Rhaenys out of pleasure. Nonetheless, they were all proven dragon riders. Out of the 5 dragons that left Valyria with the Targaryens, only one survived, Balerion the Black Dread. Later on, Vhagar and Meraxes hatched on Dragonstone and would be tamed by the 2 sisters. Aegon Targaryen himself was an enigma, with a character that was hard to anticipate or get accustomed with. His Valyrian steel blade Blackfire never left his side, and he was considered among the greatest warriors of his age, but he took no pleasure in using Blackfire or showing his skills in tourneys or melees. His dragon, Balerion the Black Dread, was only mounted when needed, either to go to battle or to travel swiftly across the land and sea. His presence was commanding and people were drawn to his leadership, but only had one true friend, Orys Baratheon, his companion since childhood. Orys, along with his sisters, made his small council, and he left much of the day-to-day governance of the realm to them, but he was fully aware when he needed to intervene, and he would do so decisively. When Aegon turned his sights onto Westeros, the land was divided into 7 kingdoms that had barely any time for peace. In the north, the Starks of Winterfell were rulers. Down south were the Dornish Sands, where the Martell princes held sway. The Lannisters were rulers of the Westerlands that were rich with gold. The fertile Reach was ruled by House Gardener of Highgarden. The mountainous Vale belonged to House Arryn, and the always troubled Stormlands was ruled by House Durrandon. And it was the conflict in this little piece of land in the middle, called the Crowlands, that drew Aegon into the muddy politics of Westeros. The ruler of Stormlands, King Argilac of House Durrandon, has been losing power over centuries. From the west, the kings of the Reach often occupied territory unchallenged. The Dornishmen raided from the south, and the up-and-coming Harren the Black, along with his grandsire, have taken control over the Riverlands from the Stormlords. King Argilac reached out to Aegon asking for help in return for his daughter's hand and, most importantly, lands east of God's Eye, from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush. Looking at the map, this includes the gigantic castle of Harrenhal that took 40 years to build and was the conception of the ruthless Harren the Black, the current challenger of the Stormlords. While Aegon was not interested in taking another wife, he was certainly interested in land. Sensing the desperation of King Argilac and an opportunity to establish his house on mainland, Aegon asked for additional coastal land near Blackwater Bay, namely Macy's Hook and the forest north of Windwater River. And the pact would be sealed by marrying King Argilac's daughter to Orys Baratheon, who was Aegon's childhood friend and champion. To this last part, though, King Argilac angrily refused. The suggestion enraged him to a point that he cut off the hands of Aegon's messengers and returned them in a box with the message that these would be the only hands that Orys Baratheon would receive. Now, this reaction didn't bother Aegon too much. But what it did show him was how blindly proud the lords of Westeros were at the time when they had little power. This was the true opportunity for Aegon. He summoned the little friends he had, his old allies, the Valyrians, and a few more sworn lords from nearby islands and inland. Along with his sisters, Aegon put together their plan and prepared some 3,000 men for what was to become the greatest conquest in history. On the seventh day, a cloud of ravens burst from the towers of Dragonstone to the lords of the Seven Kingdoms to let them know that from this day forward there is only one king in Westeros, and that is Aegon of House Targaryen. Those who bent the knee to him will get to keep their lands and titles, those who did not would be destroyed. His small host landed in a place that would make history at the river mouth of Blackwater Rush, where at the time there were 3 hills and a small fishing village. He built a log and earth palisade on one of the hills as a base, and from there he dispatched his sisters Rhaenys and Visenya on dragonback to convince nearby castles to bend the knee. The convincing was efficient. People of Westeros have only heard of dragons, so seeing one in real life was convincing enough. Aegon split his forces 3 ways. The bulk of his army crossed Blackwater Rush towards Storm's End, led by Orys Baratheon, with Queen Rhaenys accompanying them on Meraxes. On water, the Targaryen fleet under Daemon Valerian turned for Gulltown and the Vale, overseen from the sky by Queen Visenya and the mighty Vhagar. Aegon himself marched towards the lake named God's Eye and Harrenhal, where the self-proclaimed terrible King Harren the Black resided. But none of the 3 hosts had an easy journey. Word of this new king from a foreign land spread quickly, and Westerosi men were willing to put up a fight and use the knowledge of the terrain at their advantage. Orys Baratheon's host was attacked after they crossed the Wendwater River, and more than 1,000 died before escaping into the woods. On water, the Targaryen fleet was completely destroyed by a dozen Braavosi warships, with Admiral Daemon Valerian lost to the waves. Aegon himself was attacked twice as he approached the beautiful Lake of God's Eye, and while victorious, he lost many men. But none of them were a match for the dragons. It is said that when Queen Visenya's Vhagar descended onto the bannermen of Storm's End that were fighting in the forest, she turned the forest into torches, and men, deer and boars burned to ash. On the waters of Gulltown, Queen Rhaenys unleashed Meraxes on the Braavosi ships, and spurred by the sea wind, dragonfire melted wood and flesh. At Harrenhal, even Aegon was said to be impressed by the huge stronghold. Harren the Black was famous for his construction, but not for good reason. Over 4 decades, thousands have died building the great castle, and materials for the construction plunged many families into ruin. Once Aegon's host was south of the lake, with the castle over on the north, many nearby families turned against King Harren and pledged allegiance to Aegon. Suddenly, Aegon outnumbered Harren the Black, who took refuge in his impregnable stronghold. Harrenhal was the largest castle ever raised in Westeros, and had an inexhaustible source of fresh water, huge subterranean vaults fully stocked with provisions, and massive walls of black stone impregnable by ram or trebuchet. Harren the Black and his host barred the gates and settled in behind the thick walls. Aegon did not rush to battle. Instead, he sent a messenger under the peace banner and asked to speak with the king. It is said that Aegon asked King Harren to yield, and him and his family will be spared. Aegon had 8,000 men outside, but King Harren said that what is outside is none of his concern. The walls are strong and thick. Aegon then said that they are not as high to keep out dragons, to which Harren replied that the stones do not burn. Well, Aegon has seen melted stone before, so he made a promise that by the morning, King Harren's line will be no more. King Harren believed none of it, but did send all his men with crossbows and spears up on the walls to watch for dragons. For a long part of the night, nothing happened. The men of Harrenhal's walls thought that maybe Aegon changed his mind. But Aegon took his dragon Balerion high in the sky, so high that it looked like a fly against the moon. And then it descended, so fast that the soldiers only realized it spun them when the moon was blackened. Balerion's black wings were only a hot wind in the night, impossible to see. until he bathed the castle in black fire shot through with swirls of red that they saw him. The dragon's roar shrouded the walls and everything on them in flames. The fire was so hot that everything instantly melted, the armor on the soldiers and the castle stone reddened, turning its chambers into ovens. From outside, the riverlords watched in horror as the towers glowed like embers in the night. Such was the heat that the grass surrounding the castle was torched and the nearby waters of Lake God's Eye were steaming. The towers burned until the morning, lit and relit by Balerion above and Aegon riding him. A host of 8,000 souls watched the massacre from the distance, so word quickly traveled across Westeros of the power of the dragons. With such a resounding victory, Aegon established the House of the Dragon boldly in the middle of Westeros, and from here he kept on conquering. Back at Storm's End, the arrogant King Argilac didn't falter when rumors reached him about the massacre of Harrenhal. Instead, he promised his bannermen that he will not die cooked up inside his chambers, and instead he will die with a sword in his hand. And so, he met Orys Baratheon's host on the battlefield. In numbers, King Argilac had the advantage almost 2-1, but on the morning of the battle, a steady rain started which put his cavalry at risk of getting stuck in the mud. Blinded by the desire of a heroic death, the king pushed on and started the attack. Even so, the king's push in the heavy rain took the Targaryens by surprise, and a few times they pushed them back until the last position of the Targaryens was on the hill ahead. The king's host pushed on and broke through the invaders' defenses, even with the rain turning the ground soft and muddy. When they broke through the last line of defense, they encountered Queen Rhaenys and Meraxes. The dragon didn't even have to fly to prove formidable. Its dragon flame engulfed the first line of defense in an instant, sending the warhorses into a panic and crashing the riders behind them. Thrown from his saddle, King Argilac was still fighting, holding off a dozen men that were growing more and more scared of approaching him. With Meraxes at his back, Orys Baratheon had the confidence to take the king on equal footing in a 1-to-1 battle. Their fight was brutal and both were wounded, but in the end the king got his wish. He died with a sword in his hand and a curse on his lips. Once the battle was won, Queen Rhaenys flew Meraxes into Stormend's castle, and many were worried that they would meet the same end as Harrenhal. King Argilac's daughter barred the gates and refused to surrender, saying that the queen will only win bones and blood if she takes the castle. But her soldiers were not so eager to die. By nightfall they surrendered the castle and delivered the king's daughter gagged, chained and naked to Orys Baratheon. The whole of Westeros now was on high alert, and the most powerful houses of the realm were in full preparation for war. Far in the north, King Loren of Winterfell was rallying the troops, but was fully aware that it won't be a quick one, considering the vast swaths of land that the troops had to cover to join the main army. Further down in the peaks of the Mountains of the Moon, Queen Shara of the Vale decided to boost up defenses and send her army down to the Bloody Gate instead of making any alliances. This left the two great houses of the west to put together a force to reckon with. Mern the Ninth of House Gardner was king of the Reach and boasted an impressive army. Together with Ron the First Lannister, who was king of the Rock, they joined their armies into a force of over 50,000 men, including some 5,000 mounted knights. The two armies gathered outside the village of Golden Grove and didn't linger long before starting to march towards God's Eye, which was Aegon's base. Aegon's much smaller force numbered about 5,000 men and was made up of soldiers sworn to the Riverlords more than loyal directly to House Targaryen. When King Mern and King Lannister heard of the small size of Aegon's army, they rejoiced, and their men were full of confidence. Furthermore, the terrain this time was flat, it was dry, and the skies were clear, so the scenario that killed King Argilac at Harrenhal could not be repeated. With such overwhelming numbers, the strategy for the two kings was to surround Aegon's forces on both flanks and attack from the back, while their armored knights will crush through the center. Aegon's formation was a simple crescent made of men armed with spears and pikes, with archers and crossbowmen at the back and light cavalry on the flanks. But one thing he noticed was the nice weather and the very, very dry, tall grass. This time the Targaryen king was planning to fight from the sky along with his two sisters. Eager to make battle, the two kings sounded their trumpets and started forward towards Aegon's tiny army. King Mern himself was leading the charge on his golden stallion, and spirits were very high. They crossed the plain under a rain of arrows and crashed into the Targaryen spearmen, shattering their ranks. By now the dragon riders already assessed the best possible scenario. Using the wind direction to their advantage, they descended onto the huge army with dragon flame and surrounded them with walls of fire on three sides. The wind fanned the flames and blew smoke into the faces of the advancing ranks of the two kings. Panic ensued among the fighting animals, and the smoke thickened, confusing the horse and the rider. The dry grass quickly burst into flames all around them, and those lucky enough not to catch fire were cut down by the awaiting Aegon's army as they tried to escape the flames. It is said that more than 4,000 men died in the flames in the first hour of the battle. By the end of the Field of Fire, as the battle was named afterward, tens of thousands suffered burns and many died of them a few days later. Aegon's army lost just over 100 men. King Mern died on the field, and with him the House Garner. King Ron Lannister escaped that dreadful day, but was captured the day after. He laid his sword and crown at Aegon's feet and bent the knee, and the Targaryen king, true to his word, confirmed him in his lands and lordship, naming him Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. Like dominoes, the rest of the lords and bannermen of the Reach followed suit and bent the knee to Aegon, and Aegon spared their lives and allowed them to keep their titles as promised. But the Dragon King didn't stop to enjoy the spoils of victory. He marched onwards south to Highgarden to ensure the capture of this most treasured seat of House Garner. With King Mern, last of the House Garner, lost in the battle, Highgarden was open for anybody to claim. But when he reached the beautiful city, one of the stewards, Ian Tyrell, was in charge, and he handed the keys to the city without a fight and pledged support to the conquering king. In turn, Aegon rewarded him with all the domains around Highgarden and named him Warden of the South. Aegon wanted to continue south to Old Town and Dorne, but he was quickly reminded that he was fighting on two fronts. The south was somewhat subdued, but in the north, Torrhen Stark, followed by 30,000 men, crossed the neck and was spotted passing the Twins. When they reached the River Trident, scouts quickly informed them that Aegon's host was much smaller than theirs. Torrhen Stark's commanders were putting plans together on how to attack and cross the river. Some suggested an overnight attack or assassinating the dragons while they slept overnight. But Torrhen was not as eager or as proud as King Argilac or Harren the Black. The stories of Harrenhal were confirmed by the scouts that went ahead and saw the still smoking flames of Harrenhal. Instead, King Stark decided to hold off crossing the river and made a decision that many will remember him for: negotiate. All night, messengers went back and forth between King Stark's camp across the river and Aegon's by the ruins of Harrenhal. The following morning, King Stark himself crossed the Trident, bent the knee to Aegon, and laid the crown of the North at his feet. He rose as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North under the rule of Aegon Targaryen. From that day, people called him the King Who Knelt, but no Northmen died that day, no castles were burned, and no children were orphaned. With half the realm under his control, Aegon now turned his attention to the mountains and the desert. He sent his sister Visenya to the peaks of Mountains of the Moon, where the Eyrie was its most crown jewel, to negotiate with Queen Shara of the Vale of Arryn. For Rhaenys, he had a more special mission: fly south across the Red Desert of Dorne and speak with House Martell, rulers of the vast southern land. Aegon himself went to the west to Old Town, the greatest city in all of Westeros. The city and port of Old Town was of great significance for Aegon, not only because it was the home of House of the Hightower, the oldest, richest, and most powerful house of the Reach, but it was also the seat of the High Septon, Father of the Faithful. The High Septon was like the Pope of the times. He commanded the obedience of millions of devout across the realm and was the voice of the new gods on earth. Aegon was well aware that if he wanted to conquer and rule Westeros, he needed the allegiance of the High Septon. But when he arrived in Old Town, he was welcomed with open arms and open gates by Lord Manfred Hightower. It is said that when word of Aegon's landing first reached Old Town with 3 dragon beasts in tow, the High Septon locked himself in his sept for 7 days, praying to the new gods for advice on what to do. And the gods spoke and said that should they take arms against the dragon, the city will surely burn. So, Lord Manfred Hightower decided not to oppose Aegon on the battlefield and instead bend the knee and spare his city and house of any suffering. And so, 3 days later, Aegon was officially anointed in the Starry Sept by the High Holiness himself as Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. And although his official name was King of the Seven Kingdoms, there was one kingdom that was not yet confirmed, Dorne. Riding with golden Meraxes, Rhaenys crossed thousands of miles of red desert and only stopped for water where it could be found, and food. There was no welcome reception for her. She flew to the town of Vaith, only to find it empty. Further down the river, to God's grace, the city was left with women and children. Onwards she went to Lemonwood, and again the same, women and children. No men, no resistance either. Finally she reached Sunspear, the ancient seat of House Martell, where she found the Princess of Dorne, Moreira Martell, waiting in her abandoned castle. Moreira was fat, almost blind and bald, her skin yellow and sagging, but her wits were younger than most girls half her age. Facing Rhaenys in her chambers, she didn't want to fight, but she didn't want to kneel either. Rhaenys understood, but she warned that when they return, it will be with fire and blood. The old Princess of Dorne said that they can burn them, but they will never bend, break, or make them bow. The dragons are not welcome there. And so, Rhaenys left the princess and the kingdom of Dorne unconquered. Back at the top of the mountains, Visenya approached her mission differently. The mountains of the moon are tallest of Westeros, but a dragon can fly higher. Queen Shara Arryn of the Vale strengthened her defenses across all entry points, but this was useless against Visenya on top of Vhagar. She took her dragon up in the sky above the clouds and the mountain peaks and watched the Eyrie from above. Then she swiftly descended and appeared in the grey sky and landed in the inner courtyard of the Eyrie castle. By the time the queen rushed to meet them with a dozen guards at her back, Visenya had the time to make a new friend. The queen's boy, Ronald Arryn, was sitting on Visenya's knee, staring at the dragon, wonderstruck. He asked her mother repeatedly if he can go flying with the lady. His mother smiled at him and bowed at Visenya like two old friends. She ceded the Vale to Visenya the same day, and it is said that the little King Ronald flew to the mountain peaks on the back of Vhagar 3 times. That is how Visenya Targaryen brought the Vale of Arryn into her brother's realm. And thus, the 7 kingdoms were made into one by the will of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. To everybody's surprise, King Aegon didn't choose any of the big towns as his seat of rule. Instead, he proclaimed his intent to make his court in the up-and-coming little town rising on the 3 hills where the king first landed in Westeros, and aptly called it King's Landing. From there, Aegon the Dragon would rule his realm, holding court from a great metal seat made from the melted, twisted, beating and broken blades of all his fallen foes, a seat that would soon be known everywhere as the Iron Throne of Westeros. In the early days of the year 4 AC, Aegon turned his sights again towards subduing Dorne. As promised, they returned with fire and blood. Riding Meraxes, Rhaenys Targaryen went ahead and set Planky Town ablaze, but left the nearby town of Lemonwood intact so they can witness the flames and smoke rising from the floating town. Aegon understood well that a conquest with just dragons will not last, so he assembled all his might, an army of 30,000 souls, and marched into Dorne. He took the bulk of the army and entered the Prince's Pass, while his hand, Orys Baratheon, took some 1,000 knights via the Bonway, aiming to take Ironwood by surprise. But the Dornishmen never offered battle. Instead, they showed Aegon and his allies a different type of war, the war of attrition. As they advanced, they found towns abandoned, fountains poisoned, crops burned, animals dead and rotten. The blistering sun above Dorne was the biggest enemy. Even in winter, it was bright and hot, making people and horses want to drink more water than usual. Once out of the pass, Aegon sent half of his force towards Hellholt with Lord Harlan Tyrell at its helm. Horses and men died on the way, and when they got there, they found the town abandoned, no food or crops to eat, and the wells poisoned. Up in the Bone Pass, Orys Baratheon and the King's Knights were making good progress until they reached the higher, more treacherous pathways, where big boulders were dropped from above, out of nowhere, by attackers they didn't even see. As they tried to cross the River Will, a huge army appeared and rained arrows upon them. Orys Baratheon ordered the retreat, but behind, a massive rockfall blocked their way. They were pelted with arrows and rocks, and little of them survived. Those that did, among them Orys himself, were taken captive to the fastness of Will, an old ally of House Martell of Dorne. The king himself was a bit more successful. He took Skyreach by storm, which provided access to water, and with water they could boil some food. With energy restored, they descended upon Ironwood and took it after a brief siege. From here, they advanced towards Tor, where, with the recent passing of the king, the regent ceded the castle without a fight. As they approached Ghost Hill, Aegon found this to be empty too. When the Dragon King finally reached the Dornish capital Sunspear, there was no sign of Princess Martell either. He only found his sister Rhaenys and 3 more towns that she'd taken without a fight, among them the busy port of Lemonwood. She accepted obeisances from women and children, the only ones occupying the towns. Nobody acknowledged where the lords and princes were, nor where the men were. Aegon had nothing left to do but declare victory. He gathered what little Dornish dignitaries remained behind, told them that he is king from now on, named a few of his men as castellans and stewards to rule the castles he has conquered, along with a warden of the sands to rule Dorne in his name. Then he departed for King's Landing. But something was amiss. It didn't feel like a full victory. The little resistance he encountered felt suspicious. And he was right. No sooner that King Aegon and his troops reached King's Landing, that Dorne erupted into full rebellion. Dornish men appeared from nowhere and recaptured all cities within a fortnight. Literally everything was taken back and the castellans put to swords or tortured to death. For 7 years, this war would drag on and on with attacks and retaliations, assassinations, raids and short truces and periods of inactivity. In year 9 AC, after Visenya and Aegon burned more cities with their dragons, the Dornish retaliated and attacked villages all the way into the Reach, stirring the fury of the high towers of Old Town. They rallied their troops to push out the raiding force, but that was anticipated by the Dornish, so a second army came via the sea and attacked Old Town itself. Although the walls of the town proved impregnable, the Old Town was the biggest city in the realm, so an attack here was incredibly brazen. This type of harassment and never-ending problems were putting Aegon's patience and pride to the test. With fury in their purple eyes, in year 10 AC, Visenya, Rhaenys and Aegon returned to Dorne on the back of their dragons to rain fire over the Sand Vipers. Aegon descended upon Skyreach with Balerion, Visenya and Vhagar on Starfall, and Rhaenys and Meraxes on Hellholt. And that is where tragedy struck. Dragons are mighty beasts. Their scales and skin are harder than steel, but they are not without weakness. As Meraxes banked above Hellholt, a defender atop the castle's highest tower triggered the scorpion arrow that hit the dragon right in the eye. Meraxes came crashing down in mortal agony, taking a tower with him and a large section of the wall. Much speculation is on what happened with Rhaenys. Either she fell to her death, got crushed under the dragon, or was captured and died in the Dornish dungeons. One thing is certain: Rhaenys Targaryen, sister and wife of King Aegon the Conqueror, died at Hellholt in Dorne in the 10th year after Aegon's conquest. They say Targaryens are closer to gods than men, and so is their ego. For the next 2 years, Aegon and Visenya returned again and again to Dorne, riding their dragons with fury and burning each and every city 2 or 3 times over. Hellhold, in particular, was never allowed to build another tower. The fires of Balerion were so hot that sand fused into glass in places. No Dornish lords were spared, no prisoners taken. Every single port, ship or man bearing the Dornish banner would die. But the Dornish were stubborn as well. They continued the harassment with assassinations, murders and insults to House Targaryen. They remained unbowed, unbent and unbroken. It was only when the Dornish princess died in 13 AC that peace returned. Her 60-year-old son was no fan of continuing to make war, so the first thing he did was to send a peace delegation to King's Landing led by his own daughter. The peace offering was enticing, but it did not include submission. After so much bloodshed on both sides, a dragon and a sister lost. Accepting such a peace would show signs of weakness across the realm, and would mean Rhaenys died in vain. When Aegon politely refused the Dornish daughter, she handed him a letter from her father, and for Aegon's eyes only. It is said that as he read the letter while on the Iron Throne, Aegon's hand was dripping blood so hard he was gripping the throne's armrests. He burned the letter, mounted Balerion, and went to his home in Dragonstone, where he spent the night. The next day, he returned and accepted the peace offering, signing a treaty of eternal peace. What was written in that letter remains unknown to this day. What is certain was that the First Dornish War ended in 13 AC after 9 years of heavy fighting. This was to be Aegon's last war as King of Westeros. But his rule was not all about war. Aegon and his sisters did their best to unite the realm in other ways besides submission. Aegon made great efforts to include men and women from all parts of the realm to his court and councils. His former enemies were encouraged to send their younger sons and daughters to court to serve as pages, cupbearers and squires, and the girls as handmaidens and companions to Aegon's queens, all in an effort to educate them and at the same time unite the families throughout marriages. In this, Queens Rhaenys and Visenya were experts at. They brokered marriages between noble houses of the land in order to tie the conquered lands together and make the kingdom one. While Aegon was the ultimate authority, he placed a lot of trust and respect in his 2 sisters. Visenya and Rhaenys were so influential during his reign that they were considered as powerful as Aegon himself. Aegon kept the peace this way for many years. The small folk needed to see their king and queens and relay any grievances they had. At the same time, the sight of the king riding Balerion the Black Dread was enough to instill loyalty in any restless lord. The king also allowed for traditions and laws to continue and flourish. He would not interfere in the ways the lords would rule their lands. The laws of inheritance and succession remained unchanged, the feudal structures untouched, and some harsher laws, like the privilege of the first knight, continued. All of this because Aegon's main concern was maintaining peace. The loss of Rhaenys and the war with Dorne may have softened the king, but as much power as he had, he understood the value of life. And King's Landing grew, expanding from Blackwater Bay more and more into land to cover the 3 hills that stood near the mouth of the water. The highest of those hills had become known as Aegon's High Hill. The other 2 were named Visenya's Hill and the Hill of Rhaenys. With the city growing, trade was growing too. Ships were coming down from all corners of the world, and within years, King's Landing became a thriving city, worthy of being home to the greatest house in Westeros. Visenya was ever worried with his brother's safety. After so many wars, so many attempts on his life or near misses, she had to do something to protect her brother at all times. So, she decided to recruit a King's Guard, the best of the best from all of the realm. And since the realm had 7 kingdoms, there should be 7 knights protecting the king at all times. And so the King's Guard came into being, a brotherhood of the finest knights in the realm, cloaked and armored in pure white with no other purpose but to defend the king, giving up their own lives if need be. Visenya handpicked the first 7 and she did so very well. During Aegon's reign, 2 of the king's guards died defending their king, and the rest would serve with valor until the end of their lives. At last, Aegon was not only concerned with the longevity of his kingdom, but with the longevity of his lineage too. Both his queens have gifted him with a child, and both were boys of pure Targaryen blood. The boys Rhaenys and Maegor would prove to be as different as earth and water, and make their mark in Westeros history with both kindness and cruelty. But that is for our part 2 of this series. I hope you enjoyed this retelling of the beginnings of House Targaryen along with one of its most important kings. But what about you? Which parts of the book you enjoyed the most, and which part you would like to see made into a TV series? Don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for part 2 coming very soon. See you next time.